Welcome to this exciting video in which we will talk about one of the most powerful military groups, the Wagner Russian Savage Group. We will take you on an expedition around this group and learn about the story of its formation and history in wars and conflicts, and learn about the brutal weapons and tactics used by members of this supergroup that influenced its resounding successes. Let's prepare together for this exciting military journey and discover together the strength of this military group since the entry of Wagner's forces. Massacres have begun, some of whom may have been officers of the Russian Federal Security Service. According to communications intercepted by German intelligence, Russian mercenaries belonging to the Wagner Group were also involved. Elements of the Russian private military company known as the Wagner Group are fighting in Syria, Africa and currently Ukraine. So who are the Wagner mercenaries? What are the goals of the company owned by one of the figures closest to the Russian president? How was Wagner founded? Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine in late February, reports revealed that elements of the Wagner Group were increasingly involved in the war on behalf of Russian forces. The Wagner Group was founded in 2014 and in the same year it was publicly assigned its first mission in Crimea, where its uniformed mercenaries helped Russian-backed separatist forces take control of Crimea. With the outbreak of the Russian war in Ukraine, Wagner mercenaries were mobilized at the beginning of the war to reinforce Russian forces stationed on the front lines. But as the war continued, reliance on Wagner elements increased increasingly in decisive battles, especially on the Bakhmout and Solidar fronts. The United States and the European Union have imposed sanctions on Wagner and its owner, as well as most of its leaders. Wagner elements. Where are they stationed? The Russian military company Wagner existed years before the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, and was composed of a few thousand mercenaries, most of whom are believed to be veterans and former members of elite military units, who were well trained. But as Russia's losses in the Ukraine war mounted, the company's owner, Yevgeny Prigozhin, one of Russia's most prominent oligarchs known as Putin's cook, began expanding the group by recruiting Russian prisoners and Russian and foreign civilian agents. Prigozhin appeared in a video last September talking to prisoners in the courtyard of a Russian prison and promising them that if they traveled to Ukraine to fight for 6 months, their sentences would be commuted. It is estimated that 20,000 members of the Wagner Group are currently fighting in Ukraine. Although they are increasingly involved in the war, the effectiveness of Wagner's elements on the battlefield cannot be definitively determined, and experts say Wagner has suffered heavy casualties without making significant progress in favor of Russian forces. The Russian constitution does not authorize the creation of private military companies or mercenary army. It states that the responsibility for the security and defense of the country rests solely with the state, while Russian law prohibits Russian citizens from working as mercenaries. Yet the law allows government-run companies to establish and own private armed security forces, legal loopholes that represent a quasi-legal gray area for the Wagner Group to operate. Wagner operatives are deployed in African countries to provide support and security to Russian mining companies and the companies that work with them. While Russia has been accused of using Wagner to control Africa's natural resources as well as influence political affairs and conflicts in countries such as Libya, Sudan, Mali and Madagascar. The Wagner Group has also been active in Syria. But Russia is not the only country in the world that owns private military companies, but it extends to countries such as the United States, South Africa, Iraq and Colombia, as these countries have private military companies operating inside and outside them. However, these PMCs operate modestly. The International Criminal Court and the United Nations have sounded the alarm about the proliferation of mercenaries and private military and security companies in the armed conflicts that afflict many countries of the world. Russian state sponsorship. But what is remarkable about the Wagner Group is its close relationship with the Russian government, as well as its considerable reach. While operatives working for other private military companies are tasked with providing security services, Wagner operatives have been involved in major missions in conflicts and civil wars, and their reputation has been damaged by their members' adoption of far-right ideas. Dmitry Yudkin, a former brigadier general in the Russian army who founded the group, has close ties to the Night Wolves, a nationalist extremist known for its white supremacy and a motorcycle club but subject to sanctions from the United States, the United Kingdom and the European Union. The club is believed to have the support of the Russian government. and images circulating on social media platforms show Wagner operatives promoting the ideas and rhetoric of the far-right organization Night Wolves. A quick look at Russia's involvement in Ukraine and Syria provides a cautionary narrative for Libya, the Central African Republic, Mali and other countries. For years, the Kremlin has poured fighters and money into the Syrian conflict in support of President Bashar al-Assad as it seeks to consolidate its geopolitical influence. Private military companies have poured into Syria in recent years, to the point where they are undermining the role of the Syrian army. In a September 2019 report, the Syrian Network for Human Rights accused the Kremlin of committing hundreds of war crimes during its military operations in Syria since 2015. In March 2021, 3 rights groups from France, Syria and Russia filed a landmark legal complaint in Moscow against the Wagner Group, over the beheading of a Syrian citizen in 2017 and violations deemed to amount to war crimes. In Libya, Wagner Group mercenaries have been fighting since 2018 to support the Russian-backed Libyan National Army, LNA, led by General Khalifa Haftar. Libya's vast oil reserves and strategic location on the Mediterranean Sea are of interest to Moscow, which is seeking to strengthen its position in the Middle East and North Africa. Wagner is suspected of having the largest overseas presence in Libya, while other Russian private military companies are also involved in the conflict, the United Nations said. In Mali, where Wagner Group mercenaries guard the presidential palace, a fierce debate erupted over a march operation in Mora that killed hundreds of people. Mali's military and eyewitnesses interviewed by the press and Human Rights Watch described the operation as a massacre of civilians, with rape and looting carried out by Malian soldiers and foreign fighters believed to be Russians. Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the private military company Wagner, has been openly critical of the Russian military and bureaucracy. After recruiting tens of thousands of fighters in Russian prisons, the Wagner Group offered them freedom and money after a 6-month conscription. Prison rights groups in Russia estimate that 30,000 prisoners accepted the offer, while videos were shared on social media showing playgrounds in a prison designed by Yevgeny Prigozhin. Brutal tactics of Wagner fighters. Ukraine's assessment of Wagner's tactics suggests pushing Russian prisoners to the front lines, where they are used during an attempt to storm Ukrainian positions with almost no fire support. The attack is launched by small groups of fighters, 12 or less, guided by drones, and those who try to escape are said to have been shot. The assessment stated that the wounded were left on the battlefield for hours. Prisoners make up the bulk of Wagner's casualties, being pushed to storm Ukrainian positions and followed by more experienced fighters with better weapons. According to the Ukrainian assessment, despite Prigozhin's brutal indifference, Wagner's tactics are the only effective ones for the poorly trained Russian mobilized forces that make up the majority of ground forces. The assessment suggests that the Russian military may be adapting its tactics to become more like Wagner, saying, instead of traditional tactical groups of the Russian armed forces, it is proposed to create attack units. U.S. officials said Wagner appeared to be competing with the Russian military for power in the Kremlin. John Kirby, the National Security Council's Strategic Communications Coordinator, said, in certain cases, Russian military officials are effectively subordinate to Wagner's command, and it is clear to us that Wagner is emerging as a rival power center for the Russian military. As the U.S. assessment says, tensions between the Russian Defense Ministry and Wagner are increasing as Putin relies on the Wagner Group in Ukraine. There are about 50,000 fighters from the group currently deployed in Ukraine and most of them prisoners. According to Kirby, the U.S. administration described the group as a transnational criminal organization and imposed new sanctions on it and affiliated groups, with the U.S. first targeting the group with sanctions in 2017. Wagner has been growing for years and active in Africa, and Wagner's development since it was founded in 2014 during the Russian invasion of Crimea. In 2019, Lester, Sebastian Chukla and Clarissa Ward published a startling report revealing the group's training center in the Central African Republic, accusing Wagner of human rights abuses in Africa and Syria. Wagner defectors live in fear, as people who leave it can be brutalized, and a video of the murder of Yevgeny Prigozhin, a Wagner defector who was retaken by the Russians, sparked fear among other fighters. And from here our journey ends. Subscribe to the channel to receive everything new.